Hi, it's Alexander Russo from The Grade, and this is the Education Show. And I'm so happy to be here today with Charlie Barone from the National Parents Union. Charlie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Charlie, if there's anyone who can tell us what's going on in education reform today, it's you. What's happening in education reform?
A lot of different things are happening. I think in the past, we've gone through periods where there are like very predominant policy initiatives going on that are nationwide, that everybody's debating. This isn't so much one of those times. There's a lot of different things going on in different places and not one national zeitgeist. I think, you have in the red states a big push toward choice right now. We've seen a lot of states pass choice policies in recent years. Those are all red states. None of the blue states seem to be flirting with it at all. There are obviously various explanations for that we could get into. Um, and But that's one thing that's going on. Another national conversation we're having that isn't happening everywhere, but is happening a lot of different places is literacy. So I think that's maybe one thing that you want to dive in on. Um, that's a very interesting debate. There are, I think, the Harvard Stanford education scorecard pointed this up, but they plotted the states that have passed reading reforms against actual changes in reading outcomes, and they showed that having a reading reform passed at the state level is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition to improving outcomes. So they postulate that may have something to do with implementation, which I think is on the right track.
And,
Um,
and what about ed tech? Is ed tech and the reckoning over ed tech, does that qualify as ed reform, or is that just a sideshow?
I think so. I mean, I would put in the category of ed reform anything that's asking people to do something differently than they're doing now. Um, when you and I met up a few weeks ago at the EWA convention, and Matt Barnum was in the audience, and he wanted to ask a question, but we didn't have time for it. And the question he wanted to ask was, "What's the definition of education reform?" And the way I always think of it is, I was a congressional staffer, you were a congressional staffer. The standard ask if someone from the existing system came into lobbyists would generally be, hey, give us more money and don't ask us to do too much, right?
Right.
So I always think of reform in terms of, give them some resources, but ask them to do something in return. And that would be my definition of reform, because almost anything that you ask people to do differently than they're doing now, you're going to get resistant. So I think there's legit backlash to the over reliance on technology in the classroom. It's definitely a national conversation that we're having. Some of it is related to issues that folks like Jonathan Haidt have raised around screen time and social media. Other, I think, is just parent experience of seeing their kids spend what they think is too much time on ed tech in the classroom. I have two kids that are in a public middle school. They're rising eighth graders, and I do see it in their classrooms. I think there's a little bit, I can tell you from personal experience, there's a little bit of hangover in their classrooms where there's a tendency for teachers to want to give them an assignment at the beginning of the class and then have them work independently at their desk on their Chromebook and completing assignments. And then the teacher just sort of sits back. And, particularly in middle school, there's an assumption that, they're mature enough that they should be able to work independently without a lot of prodding. But then, like, what's the teacher's role, right? If it's just to hand out the assignment, what are we doing here? And then the other thing I know from my own kids is theoretically they're barred from playing games on their Chromebooks that they have assigned to them by the school, but
Yeah.
they've all figured out workarounds so that
Yeah.
they can get to it. And the teachers know it's happening. The school knows it's happening. Somehow they can't come up with a solution to to barring kids from playing games in class, which I just think is like completely unacceptable. I think there's a possibility that we would take this too far and just ban all tech. I think the one of the major pushes is just to ban tech in elementary school
Right.
as being bad, and then but I think that neglects what's going on in middle schools and high schools.
Hmm.
Where I just think there needs to be some independence from tech and from a laptop, and more engagement by teachers around helping kids figure out what they need to do to learn.
So, if I understand you correctly, anything that asks schools to do something differently qualifies as reform. It doesn't have to be everyone doing the same thing. It doesn't have to be national bipartisan legislation like we had in the past. I think I'm with you on this idea. I keep worrying about what I call NCLB nostalgia, and I appreciated at the EWA panel that you and others were saying, "Hey, reform is reform. And just because you didn't propose it or it didn't come from you, it's not happening. It's not that it's not something's not happening or that it doesn't count. Maybe one day we'll get that old school kind of reform happening again. But in the meantime, I think I hear you saying, let's go with what we've got.
I mean, on the NCLB question, there is some nostalgia. I think that's in large part driven when people look back at the data. And, again, the Harvard scorecard highlighted this, but others have highlighted this before they did.
Mm-hmm.
You see a drop off in student achievement beginning around 2013. And that was, right after the Obama administration began backing off of accountability and offering state waivers. Other things were happening at the same time. Again, you got the issue of screens and social media and phones that some people attribute to the drop in student achievement. Other trends that, like Tim Daly has pointed out, around schools assigning less homework and students reading less, and anything that's important is determined by multiple variables. So I don't think there's a single issue explanation for any of this. Then you've got COVID, obviously in 2020, that further pushed down student achievement. But the observation is it started in 2013, and one hypothesis is that has to do with the backing off on accountability that happened with waivers and states being fatigued by NCLB. Like, I don't think that's something we should go back to. I think NCLB did some good things. The disaggregation of data is huge. The testing in grades 3 through 8, you can debate it, but it's the only thing that's going to allow you to do longitudinal analysis of student scores over time, which is something the folks who opposed accountability pre-NCLB said they wanted, right? The criticism pre-NCLB is, oh, you're only testing once in grades, 3 to 5, once in 6 to 8, once in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And you're just comparing this year's students to last year's students, and you can't really see how students progress. Well, that was fixed under NCLB by doing 3 through 8. And then it did cause schools to scramble. Anybody could get on the not making adequate yearly progress list. And so everybody was trying to escape that outcome. And, the districts particularly didn't want to get caught up in that because they had to then, send some of their resources to things like tutoring and public school choice, and they were trying to avoid that. So that was the incentive system that I see having been built into it. And schools wanting to avoid restructuring, even though that wasn't really something that was required in law. But, we've learned some things since then. And this model under the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, isn't really working so well either. I wrote a piece in Education Next last year where I went through this, and this idea that you're going to identify the bottom 5% of schools and the dropout factories and then intervene in those schools to improve the system, that's not really panning out for a variety of reasons. It's not working. But what we are seeing working in some states is addressing capacity and resources tied to some evidence-based policy, particularly around reading and somewhat in math, where it's basically a tiered system of support. So unlike ESSA, you're not waiting for schools to fail. You're saying on a statewide basis, here is tier one, like what we think every school should have access to. high quality instructional materials,
Hmm.
reading coaches, those kinds of things. And then you drill down to tiers 2 and 3 that's more specialized, where you're providing extra resources to either schools that are lagging or to students that are lagging, things like high impact tutoring. And so I think we can return to a time where we could see nationwide improvements in student achievement, but I don't think the way to get there is to go back to NCLB, because we've learned things since then. And look, other things are important than student achievement. NCLB was all about student achievement. It was great that we refocused the system on that, but you've got to incentivize other types of outcomes for schools and students.
What needs to happen, or what's standing in the way? I must admit that I thought that perhaps the time was getting closer and closer that folks would want to think or look at student achievement again, or do something bipartisan or national. What are the obstacles? What needs to happen? Or are we at that moment of renewed energy, and I just haven't realized it yet?
I don't think we're at that moment. I think the obstacles are on the right, this push toward choice and this idea that choice solves all your accountability problems. Once you provide parents with choices in the system, that's going to be the mechanism that drives improvements in quality, because people are going to want to attract students, because along with students come dollars. And I think that's a fairly flawed model. First and foremost, you're not really giving students the choice, you're giving schools the choice, right? You give parents some money, but that doesn't mean that these private schools are going to open up to them. It just
Right.
means that it could help pay for tuition if they spend several more $1,000s out of their own pocket. So the schools don't have to take them, and the parents aren't really given enough money to buy a good private school education anyway. So that's why in places like Arizona, you're seeing 75% of the funding going to parents who already have their kids enrolled in private schools. So I don't know when the right is going to admit that that's not a model for improving quality, because they're pretty adamant about it right now. But that has to happen, right? And it's happened in some places, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee. They're not putting all their eggs in the school choice basket, but other states are, right? Indiana is pretty much saying right now, we're not going to improve. We're not going to really work hard to improve low performing schools. We're just going to offer more options to give parents to take advantage of them. On the left, I think the primary obstacle is Democrats don't have permission from the education establishment to talk about outcomes. They are discouraged from talking about outcomes. If you want to improve outcomes, the first thing you got to do is start talking honestly about where you are. I still watch a lot of hearings in Congress. I will tell you, like, Democrats have a really hard time bringing up outcomes because they're discouraged from doing it, because it's seen as bad mouthing the current system, and the current system is already under attack. So, why do you want to further attack the system with negative talk about outcomes when it's already under attack? That's a recipe for things never getting any better. I have seen that change though, and I think what's happening with reading is helping change this dynamic. Like, just over the last 6 months in watching hearings, I've seen more Democrats willing to talk about reading outcomes. And, this is not scientific. It's just me observing what's happening in hearings. So I don't have data on this, but my impression is that there's a higher comfort level, because just the level of awareness that's been raised around student literacy is making it more comfortable for Democrats to bring this up. Now you got to do something about it, right? Eventually.
Hmm.
I think that's the first step, and I see some progress on that first step being made these days.
One of the things that I learned from talking to Emily Hanford, the journalist behind Sold the Story, when I asked her why the series was acceptable, was adopted by educators, and she said, well, it creates a permission structure for people to look at their own practice that doesn't blame them for the results. And in so doing, it allows them to think, oh, I was misled. I was told a story. I was just doing what I was told to do or what everyone else was doing, and that was, if I recall her answer correctly, that was an incredibly important thing because it wasn't blaming the system. It was allowing people to look at it. Is that part of what you're talking about? You see happening?
Yeah, I think that's a really sharp insight. I think one of the things that's made doing accountability hard is people feel like they're being blamed or shamed because of the low student outcomes, and it makes them defensive. And they feel like they're working hard, and in most cases, they are working hard, right?
Right.
And you know, back when I worked on the Hill for Congressman George Miller, we tried to push teacher prep reform, which I know you did with your boss, Jeff Bingaman, and we worked together on some of those things. And, one of Miller's primary talking points were that students in schools of education were being shortchanged. They were being cheated, sold a bill of goods that if they completed these programs, they'd be prepared to teach in a classroom. And then when they arrived in a classroom, most of them will tell you like they weren't, right? They weren't taught how to teach reading. They weren't taught how to manage a classroom. They weren't taught how to develop a curriculum and a syllabus and those kinds of things. So I think that's a big part of it. And I think, her series, there've been so many other efforts over the years to critique what's wrong with the teaching of reading, and somehow Hanford broke through, right, and just got widespread recognition. And I think her taking on the training programs themselves with the implicit message that it's what's taught in those programs that's the problem, not the people going through them. That
Mhm.
was a powerful part of the change that I think she helped bring about.
Let's talk a little bit about National Parents Union getting active on literacy. 2 or 3 or 5 years ago, I don't know that I would have thought of the NPU as literacy focused. Can you tell us a little bit of the backstory about how you came to see the issue as important and viable, and recently helped write a bill that just got introduced?
Yeah, NPU is very parent driven. And so the NPU agenda um, is based on what NPU hears from parents about what they want from their school systems. And, they want a lot of different things. But there has been a surge in parent concern about literacy. And I think it is in part due to, I mean, a disproportionate number of parents who are on the reform side of the equation um, encompasses those with children who have dyslexia or some other learning disability.
Right.
They are told by their school, if they're lucky, that their kid has a disability. They may just be told by their school, oh, your kid's having a problem with reading, and like we don't really know how to help them. And in a lot of school systems, it takes a long time for them to do the assessments, to get identified, and to get an IEP. And even once that happens, whether or not the supports and other things come with that, it can take years. And over the course of that time, your kid's gone from being a second or third grader to a seventh or eighth grader. And, they're in the danger zone of having, reaching a point of no return, where to get them caught up is a monumental task. So a lot of parents were flagging that as being something that they were concerned about. And, they were seeing that in some states like Mississippi, Louisiana, and others were moving ahead in a way that improved outcomes. So that became something that parents wanted to do. And then, the other thing that comes along with NPU is you have an army of people who you can bring to the Hill or a state legislature to lobby, and they're voters, right? So when NPU goes to the Hill, there's an effort made to match those doing the Hill Day with those that represent them in Congress. And so you have members of Congress hearing from their own constituents about what they want from the system. And these are people that vote, and these are people that can help influence other voters. So it sort of was a natural niche for MPU based on what they were hearing from parents, based
Yeah.
on the gap between what was possible and what was actually happening in a lot of states and districts. That kind of rose to the top of the agenda.
And what's the response been so far from the Hill, from other education groups?
From the Hill, I mean, I think one win has been chalked up, which is that you've had parents come to the Hill, tell their representatives that this is something they want to be addressed, and that in turn making it harder for those representatives to just ignore the issue. So the fact that you have both Democrats and Republicans willing to sign on to a bill that would change a current program in ways that are more aligned with the evidence. And for Republicans, that means breaking a little bit with this idea that there should be no federal role in education, which is
Yeah,
particularly huge right now, given where the administration is. And for Democrats, like I said before, being willing to talk about outcomes and changing practice. So I feel like that's already a win, is just winning those folks over. So, like, if these changes would pass this year, that would be great. But if they don't pass this year, at least you've helped establish like a foundation of supporters on this issue so that when the time comes to address it, you're going to have a ready made support group of people on the Hill who want to do something about this. So, sometimes it takes years in this business to get somewhere, as you know.
def- definitely.
Pre-ESSA, we started, I mean, pre-ESSA started like 2008, right? And it took like 7 years of machinations to get to a final bill. So sometimes it's a long road and there's a lot of dress rehearsals.
Where are the other groups? Have other groups signed on? I'm thinking about the Ed Trust, um,
Yep,
things like that.
they're supportive. The bill was written in conjunction with those groups. E4E is a big supporter. A lot of disability groups are big supporters.
Mhm.
Um, there's a desire to do something on this issue. So I think there's a good coalition around this. There's skeptics, but I think there's a good foundation has been laid to do something on this.
Let's talk for a couple of minutes about media coverage, past and current. Um, the grade is all about trying to help education journalists and the folks who are covered by education journalists sort of understand each other a little bit better and to help ensure that the conversation is healthy, not cartoonish, not overly credulous or overly cynical. What's your take on the coverage that you see of the issues that are important to you? And what insights would you want to share with journalists as they think about their coverage in the upcoming year?
Well, that's a big one. I think the coverage overall is pretty good. I think a lot of people on the national beat are getting the story right. They're asking the right questions. Um, you know, I read the New York Times every day. I thought the series of articles the New York Times did around the Harvard Stanford scorecard was excellent. They went through the decline in achievement that started in 2013 and offered evidence, hypotheses on why that happened from,
Mm-hmm.
reliable experts in the field. They explained what was in the scorecard. I think sometimes the coverage, though, is a little simplistic. I brought this up at the EWA where I feel like the role of civil rights and disability groups and accountability is being underreported. They played a big role on ESSA in 2015. I'm not saying ESSA is the pinnacle of accountability, but the fact that ESSA has any accountability at all is largely due to civil rights and disability groups, and I don't feel that was well covered. And those groups right now are revisiting their positions on the issues, particularly of assessments and accountability. And I think they are approaching it in a very nuanced way, where not everybody, these are groups like National Urban League and Unidos US who go back to their communities and um, in the same way that NPU relies on the feedback and ideas from parents, these groups rely on the local activists and the parents that they talk to through their work in each of these states and communities. And, they're hearing a very nuanced take on assessments and accountability. Like they like a lot of what's happened over the years from assessments and accountability in terms of schools being paid attention to.
Right.
They don't like some of the stigma that's attached to school when it's low performing, where they feel helpless that they can't do anything. They don't like that the resources aren't always made available to the schools that are struggling. They think that's something that should occur automatically, and it's just not. But that's a much more nuanced, and I realize like the press doesn't gravitate always to nuance. So that's just sort of a given in this business. But I think that's something to watch where they're not firmly on the accountability hawk or the status quo side of the equation. They're really trying to figure out.
Okay.
And that goes back, right? Like in 2008, there was the suspend NCLB bill. And at the time, I was lobbying at the time, and everyone on the Hill, all the staff was like, oh, this is going to be easy to do a suspend NCLB. Like everybody hates it, nobody likes it. And then, the leadership conference on civil and human rights came out and said, wait a second, like we consider this a civil rights law in
Mm-hmm.
some ways, and it's helping our communities. And it really put the brakes on
Mm-hmm.
the whole effort to suspend NCLB. So it goes back, it goes back 17 or 18 years at this point. So that's something to pay attention to. I think another thing I liked about the Harvard Stanford Education Scorecard was that they highlighted school districts that were doing a particularly good job, high poverty
Right.
school districts that were showing high achievement. And I
Like,
think,
like 100 of them, right?
yeah, I think that's a story that could be better covered. When I
Yeah.
was There's just a lot of success stories about it. And if I were a reporter and I had some resources, I'd want to go out to talk to those schools, to ask them how they did it. And then I'd want to go out to other schools and to say, hey, this school is doing this through these means and they're showing success. Like, is that something you'd like to pursue? And if so, um, what do you need in order to be able to pursue it and to start that conversation to get at what some of the obstacles are?
Yeah, I just to pick up on that for a second, there was the mention of 100 plus schools. Was it schools or districts? Probably
Yes.
districts. Yeah, but it actually turned out to be sort of hard to find the list on the site, and it was in PDF form, which is not the most helpful thing in the world, especially if you're not brilliant on technology the way I am. I was hoping for more coverage on that as well, and on the issue of the civil rights and disability groups' positions on accountability. I haven't seen very much about that at all, to tell you the truth. And I'm having a little bit of PTSD flashbacks because I'm remembering, and you probably know the story much better than I do. I'm remembering that an NAACP chapter came out against reform. Do you remember this story?
Yeah, I forget the guy's name, but he was in California at the time. He was a local NAACP leader. He hated accountability, hated charters. Um, National, though, stayed independent from him. And, they have a lot of chapters. So each of the
Right.
chapters is going to have a slightly different take on all these issues. But
Right, but somehow, in terms of nuance, I remember that distinction, but I remember it got dumbed down to the NAACP being against,
yeah,
and was one of the moments where I thought, "Oh shit, this is not going to go well." I'm hoping that if there and NAACP is a federation and people get to have their own state positions, but um, I'm hoping that journalists can sort of track these relationships and these dynamics carefully rather than just sort of dumbing them down.
Yeah, and it's always going to be controversial, right? So, like, I came to the Hill, I'll just admit it, in 1993, right? So we're talking over 30 years ago. And we did the Clinton ESEA bill along with Goals 2000 in 1994. And Goals 2000 was kind of the setup for the standards, assessments, and accountability regime that came through Clinton's 94 ESEA. And from the time that passed, all the people who are uncomfortable with testing, and testing is like imperfect, right? So, um, would attack it. And it always seemed like the support for assessments would fall apart. But they've endured, right? They've changed over time. They've been improved, I think, but they've been sustained. And so it's always going to be controversial because they're not the whole story, right? I have, again, two middle school kids. I look at their scores on the New Jersey summative assessment, but I also look at their grades and the classroom feedback. And like each of those gives me different types of information. And I can see things that aren't covered on the test that are picked up in the classroom and vice versa, right? So it's always going to be controversial, but I think the media can really help reflect all sides of the debate in a way. And again,
Yeah,
I realize the media nuance isn't always the most attractive
right.
selling for an article, but even if you want to do conflict, you know, there's conflict within the coalitions and there's conflict between the coalitions that you could cover.
Which can be fascinating stuff. One last question, Charlie, and thank you so much for sharing these thoughts. I always learn a lot when we're talking. Stephen Wilson, a charter school guy who you may know better than I do, but he came out with a book and an article making the claim, and I'm paraphrasing here, that social justice activism undid was sort of centrally responsible for undoing highly effective charter school networks and reform writ large. Again, I'm paraphrasing. What's your take on the role of the progressive politics, for lack of a better way of saying it, in school reform?
It's a tough issue. I mean, on the one hand, charters are perfectly positioned in the center of the choice debate because they address a lot of the criticisms of choice, right? They have to be open to all students. If more students apply, then you have space for, you give out the seats via lottery. You can't have entrance criteria. You can't charge tuition. They're subject, the students have to take the same assessments as other students. The data is reported in the same way as for traditional public schools. But I think the sore point is a lot of them aren't unionized, and that makes the union oppose them because the union is pretty ruthless about wanting maximum representation and having the maximum number of dues paying members. And so charters are a threat to that. So it makes, and it's amazing that charters have survived and even thrived in very blue cities, in very blue states, right? DC is bluer than any state. Half the schools are charter.
Mm-hmm.
So, despite all the countervailing headwinds around charters,
Mm-hmm.
um, they have largely thrived, although it's always a rocky road, right? And I can tell you, like, when I was at DFER, we were big charter supporters. And it was hard to get even some reform groups to enter the fray because they just didn't want to get caught up in it. In
Right.
terms of Stephen Wilson, I'm just not buying that argument that I think the right saw charters as kind of their issue and just don't like that some of them reflecting the parents and the students involved in those schools aligned with some social justice issues around LGBTQ or around race. And I don't see that it's negatively impact their performance. When I look at Credo, which I consider to be the gold standard of charter effectiveness research, the CMOs are actually outperforming, you know, the other charter schools. So I guess if you dig into the details and you want to cherry pick the data, you could make a case. But overall, I don't think that's impeded their mission. And I think if they weren't reflecting the viewpoints of the students, right? These are market-based people, right? These conservative-based people, right? So their assumption is you want to market something where you're going to increase your market share. Well, even if you're that cynical about it, wouldn't it make sense that if the parents of the students that in your community are in favor of social justice, that your school would orient around those values? Like it just makes market sense. I don't think that's what is totally driving it. I think it's more values driven than that. But even from that sort of, you know, Milton Friedman kind of point of view, you think they would understand. But I think there's a lot of resentment that the charters and groups like TFA and other groups that the right kind of saw themselves as being historically aligned with. There was a lot of resentment that they moved into the social issues.
I may need to go back and reread Wilson because I thought that Wilson was making the case that reform suffered from attacks or criticism from the left, that work hard, be nice was a racist motto, that silent hallways were punitive, that demerits and progress boards were humiliating to kids. His claim, as I understand it, I talked to him once a year ago and again more recently, was that the left eviscerated reform and that reform went along with the evisceration, that basically the accusation was made that reform was racist and that reform uh, put its tail between its legs and agreed and went off.
I mean, the schools didn't have to do any of those things if they didn't want to, right? And schools evolve, right? So if you're finding that a no excuses discipline policy isn't working from the point of view of the parents of the kids in your school, and you want to evolve that to something that's a little bit more complicated, I don't think that you can just blame that on the left. I do agree that the left has a knee jerk response around anything that seems hard edged or that's more that's clearer in terms of policy. So, like I remember back when I was working for the House Education and Labor Committee, and Lindsey Graham was a member of the committee. This is the pre-Trump Lindsey Graham, who was a little easier to work with, and we worked with him on some things. He used to like just antagonize witnesses, like when people would come in to talk about pre-K. He would just say, "Well, do you think kids should learn their letters in pre-K?" Well, I don't know. We want to have them play. We want it to be enjoyable. He's like, what if, would you say they should learn the alphabet by the time they graduate? Well, and he would just go, how about 5 letters? What if we set a standard where by the time they left pre-K, they'd have to know 5 letters, A, B, C, D, E. And,
Uh,
he would just get them on the fact that they wanted everything to be soft and squishy. And that is a thing on the left, right? Like I go through this with people I'm friends with. Like when they find out what I do, if they're more on the left, they might be surprised that I support things like testing or charter schools. And, you have to explain to them it's been like a developing position. I didn't come to the Hill with those preconceptions, but, over time, you realize the situation is a little more complicated. So, yeah, the left is, because they're touchy feely, it's not the easiest group to rally in support of reform. I think the other, if you'll give me a couple more seconds here, the other kind of ugly dynamic is white suburban voters are a drag on reform. And they're also, white, well educated suburban voters are also very influential within the Democratic Party. and they're not very aligned with reform because their kids are going to do well regardless, right? They can afford to go to the communities that have the best schools. They're able to provide their kids with supports at home that are going to determine, very positive long-term outcomes for their kids.
Hmm.
And so um, they may fluff it over with, they don't like the hard edge of reform, but they don't really have skin in the game. And I think sometimes the fact that it's not about their kids makes
Right.
them at best neutral and at worst antagonistic to reform. I just think that's the way it tends to work. And
Right. And then
that's,
if you tell them, if you add to the pile, you tell them that reform is racist, or too hard edged, whatever language you want to use, then you've lost them entirely because then they've got an excuse to back away.
yeah, well, and there is like a noblesse oblige wing of the Democratic Party, right? It's like, oh, well, we care about poor people. Let's give them some extra money for food. Let's give them some extra money for housing. Let's help them have health care. But we don't really expect that if we provide them with a high quality education that they're actually going to like excel and succeed. Like we don't go that far with it. It's sort of like alms to the poor attitude.
Mhm.
And I've seen that throughout my political career. They don't even realize that that's their attitude, but it is.
Charlie, I could ask you questions for days, but I promise not to. Charlie Barone from the National Parents Union, thank you so much.
All right. Great to see you. Good to be with you.